My name is Brent Sheets. I'm the research manager for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and I'd like to just thank everybody for coming tonight very much. This is our monthly lecture series. We meet, I think, the third Tuesday of every month. Tonight we have with us Antony Scott, who's going to provide us with a comparison of Fairbanks energy options that he's developed, a kind of an independent analysis and an apples-to-apples ways of looking at the various projects that we have the benefit of getting to consider here in Fairbanks. It's too bad our energy costs are so high that we have to come up with these kinds of projects, but still it'll be a very good time. Next month, what can we learn from energy development in Iceland? There was a fair number of people that traveled from the state of Alaska over to Iceland recently. My goodness. And we'll be hearing from Gwen Holdman 1 month from now. But tonight, we're going to hear from Antony Scott. Before I do that, I also want to acknowledge our other partners, the Cooperative Extension Service, which is helping to host this event tonight, along with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. We hope that these lecture series are informative to the community, and we thank you all for coming and supporting us and the Blue Loon as we do these, as we make these presentations. Tonight's speaker is Antony Scott. He's been with the university for about a year. He is an economist with us, and he came to the university most recently from the Division of Oil and Gas. And in the Division of Oil and Gas, he was the head of the Commercial Analysis Division, and he had been there for about 10 years. Prior to Division of Oil and Gas, well, I should back up a little bit. While he was at Division of Oil and Gas, he had an opportunity to look at some of the big gas pipeline proposals that were the talk of the day. Prior to that, he was with the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, the RCA, where he learned about cost of service, utility costs, rate making, a variety of other things. And he's bringing that vast experience with him to the university, where he's able to provide the sorts of analysis that we're going to hear about tonight. So with that, I'd like to welcome Antony to the stage, and we will be finishing up prior to 7:30, because at 7:30 we have to clear the room. But thanks.
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'd like to especially thank ASAP and Gwen Holdman for bringing me in to work on this project. It's been a lot of fun, extremely interesting. It's given me a very good opportunity to play around with some stuff that I know something about, and also to learn a lot about a bunch of projects that I haven't necessarily known a whole bunch about. I need to apologize for some false advertising. The right answer or the best answer for Fairbanks is not anything that I'm going to opine about. All of these projects have got good points and bad points, or less than perfect points. And what distinguishes them, importantly, are the different risks that they face, and as well, the importance that different people place on those risks and your kind of forward view of these things. So the effort isn't to say, here's what the best answer is. Rather, the effort in this project has been to look at the usual suspects, and they are here, and we'll talk about each of these in just a minute, and try to provide some context for comparing them, and compare them in, as Brent said, an apples-to-apples way, making similar assumptions. One of the issues that, if you casually read the newspaper, you'll probably notice, or you may or may not notice, is that different project proponents make different assumptions which are often not easily gathered from news reports or even easily understood based on the public information that is provided, and yet the assumptions that go into these projects have a lot to do with their comparative attractiveness. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is peel back as much as I could so that I could compare projects on a level playing field where we made similar sorts of assumptions. I mean, all of these projects have had cost estimates that were made at different times, making assumptions about different commodity prices, making different assumptions around how much inflation will be in the future, making different assumptions about how much of the energy that would be delivered would be sold. And all of these different assumptions are important. So as much as possible, we've tried to make the same sets of assumptions across projects when it made sense to do so. And occasionally it doesn't make sense to do so, and we'll highlight those. We're not optimizing anything. So if any of you were affiliated or have worked on or particularly familiar with any of these projects, the results won't look as well as they might if you were to really focus on telling the very best story that you could about that project. And the results, in some cases, will differ at least somewhat from what you might have seen before. And again, that's because we're trying as much as possible to make apples-to-apples assumptions across projects so that we can understand them in context. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time going through each of these because I don't know how familiar all of you are with each of these. One project which is in the news a lot right now is the idea of getting natural gas off the North Slope, untreated, purchasing it at Prudhoe Bay, conditioning the gas, removing the CO2, chilling it, liquefying it, and then running it in trucks down the haul road to Fairbanks, storing it, regasifying it, distributing that natural gas in a distribution system similar to what is common in Anchorage. And you actually already through F&G have a little bit of a gas distribution system some places here. Another one of the usual suspects, as Alaska's standalone pipeline project, which is being pursued by the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation, or also known as the Bullet Line. That project would take, again, stranded gas off the North Slope and bring it to Cook Inlet, to Anchorage. In this study, I look at 3 different project configurations. Right now, the current sponsors of that project, the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation, they're looking at one particular configuration, or up until very recently, we're only looking at one which involves throughput of 500 million cubic feet of gas a day. Earlier work on that also looked at the possibility of smaller throughput, 250 million a day, as well as larger throughput of, say, a BCF a day. Why these different throughputs? 500 million a day is the sort of throughput limit that the Alaska Gas Line Inducement Act provides for the state subsidizing an alternative gas line project. And so it's generally understood or believed, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, that larger throughput means lower costs of gas. And so they're interested in having the highest throughput they can to drive down the costs of delivering gas. 500 million a day, and in terms of the cost, the per unit cost of transportation, that's correct. It's not necessarily the same as the total cost of delivered energy to consumers, and we'll talk about that. A a smaller project, I mean, the same, essentially the same infrastructure, but at 250 million a day, something that I also looked at. That's sort of the upper end of meeting rail belt natural gas demand, both in Fairbanks and in Cook Inlet. And then I also looked at the maximum throughput you could get from the same exact pipeline system. You add some compression, but otherwise you have extra trains, but otherwise it's the same pipe system. I've looked also, and we'll talk about this, of gas costs of a spur line off a major gas sale. I'm assuming in this case the major gas sale is an LNG project which goes to Asia. It's the current kind of incarnation of the AGEA project at this point. And we've always, I think, assumed that a major gas sale would provide the cheapest gas to Alaskans. I've looked at a version of a project which has been developed up here, it hasn't been in the news much lately, of a much smaller pipeline project, say a 12-inch pipeline project, which would move gas from the North Slope to Fairbanks. That pipeline would be scaled basically to meet actual Fairbanks needs as they currently exist, more or less. One of the problems with the ASAP project at 250 million a day is even at 250 million a day, you're looking at, I don't know if it's a problem, but it's a fact that you're looking at meeting all of the energy needs essentially for the entire rail belt. There's still production in Cook Inlet. Yes, it's declining. That could change tomorrow. There's a lot of activity going on in Cook Inlet right now, both in terms of looking for gas and trying to develop in-field gas. It's not at all clear to me that the full demand associated with 250 million a day could actually be sold within the rail belt in the relevant time frame. And so one of the merits of thinking about a smaller project, a smaller pipeline project, this 12-inch fit-for-purpose project to Fairbanks, is that it is scaled to meet the existing demand. There's another project which Brent Sheets, who kindly introduced me, has been talked about for a long time, as the possibility of bringing gas from Cook Inlet up to Fairbanks, the Beluga to Fairbanks pipeline. So I looked at the possibility of doing that. Kind of for context, looked at, well, what does Susitna power bring to Fairbanks if you were to heat by wire? As well as the possibility of bringing electricity generated on the North Slope down to Fairbanks via high voltage direct current, and possibly heating by wire that way. And then finally, we look at a coal to liquids project, which was the funding rationale for doing this study. The part that I worked on with ASAP is a little slice of a much bigger project looking at a whole bunch of different aspects of coal to liquids, which involves taking coal, gasifying, liquefying that, and making liquids which you could either finish refining in the refinery here or potentially take all the way down to liquid fuels that you would, burn in your homes and fly your airplanes with or what have you. So one of the things that drives the results, and some of the results are a little bit surprising in this work, is that I pay a lot of attention here to the commodity price regime. for these different options. Most of the discussion when we think about these projects, most of the talk involves this middle piece, looking at the cost of the infrastructure to move the hydrocarbons or to move the energy from one point to another. And then what we do is we make an assumption about what you can acquire them at, usually a fixed price assumption, but I can get gas for $2. I can get gas for $3.50. I can get gas for whatever it is. And then you add those two together and you get a delivered cost of energy. It's certainly not a bad way of doing analysis. It's potentially incomplete. Because, of course, there is a supply market, and we have to purchase the hydrocarbons from willing sellers. What people are willing to sell for has nothing to do with what is fair or what we might think is appropriate. If that were the case, we wouldn't have an energy cost problem in Fairbanks because Lord knows there's an awful lot of energy in the pipeline that's running by every single day. It doesn't cost a lot to get it here. In fact, it costs very, very little to produce the marginal barrel at Prudhoe Bay and ship it in taps and have it run by Fairbanks. I mean, those costs are very small. But the commodity, oil, is very, very valuable. And because of that, we pay a lot for energy. So that's part of the results that we're going to see here are driven by analysis around commodity pricing that I've done on actual transactions in the market today, yesterday, last year, last number of years. In other words, what I've tried to do is look at what are people currently selling gas on the North Slope for? Because there's a market. There is a market for gas. Some of those market transactions are public because they're utility transactions. Other of those transactions for that stranded gas, you can infer by looking at public royalty data. So you can get some understanding of what those look like. How I've modeled it isn't truth. How I've modeled stranded gas on the North Slope, that is what that market looks like today, is a reasonable starting point. But again, I need to emphasize that I'm not trying to say, well, this is the very best you could do. You might be able to do better. You might be able to drive a harder bargain. But what I'm doing right now is looking at the markets that exist today in terms of real transactions that are occurring today. I'm also looking at, and we'll see this, the LNG market. And when I talk about the LNG market, it's important to appreciate, I'm not talking about the liquefied natural gas market in Asia for cargoes that are sold on the spot market. Most LNG is sold still under very long-term contracts. And those contract terms determine how natural gas changes as a function of oil prices. Those markets are changing. So how I model those markets for sure is wrong. I mean, for sure it's wrong. I've relied on other consultants who know a lot more about those markets than I do in terms of their assessments of what they look like. So let's look at some results. One of the things that we wanted to do is let's assume there's no state support. Let's assume that all of these projects, first pass, are funded entirely with private money. No grants, no state financing, nothing. Conventional sort of approach. And one of the things that I wanted to see is, and understand is, how is it that the price of delivered energy into Fairbanks would change as a function of oil prices. So along the x-axis here, down here we've got oil prices, A&S oil prices in real dollar terms. And along the y-axis here, we have energy cost per million BTU. And this is on a delivered basis. It includes both the cost of transportation and the cost of what it is to acquire the energy to transport it, or to burn it, or what have you. And again, assuming just private financing for all of this stuff, what you see is that the best project at a low oil price may not be the best project at a high oil price. These lines cross. And my opening remarks were, there's not a best answer, there's not necessarily a best solution. It depends in part upon what your view of the risks are and what future outcomes look like. One of the key things here is, what are oil prices going to be? Because the cost in general for, say, natural gas or electricity generated with natural gas is going to be correlated with crude oil prices. That's how these markets tend to work. Does that mean that it would be impossible to purchase gas on the North Slope for a fixed price? No, it wouldn't be impossible. It might be done. That's not generally how gas is being sold. Generally, gas is being sold indexed to crude oil. So as crude oil prices change, that natural gas price changes. So again, we say that the delivered price of energy will change for these different projects depending upon what crude oil looks like. This dashed black line here, that's heating oil in Fairbanks as a function of crude oil prices. The correlations between crude oil and heating oil are extremely high, as you know. As oil prices rise, heating oil rises. And it turns out that if you know what you're doing, and Eric Johnson, who's here, who worked with me last summer, we figured out how to do this. The correlation's exceptionally tight. So it's a very, very good predictor. If you know what the crude oil price is, I can tell you with considerable likelihood what the heating oil price will be at the retail level. So what you're trying to do is come up with an energy solution which lies below this black dashed line. If you're not below this black dashed line, there isn't any savings. So some of these start off and they're below the line and some aren't. And it depends, right? Like always, it depends. But one of the things that showed up for me is, well, a couple things. One, a lot of these projects are clustered right on top of each other. They're very similar. The other thing, though, is that there's not necessarily a lot of savings unless you've got crude oil prices on a sustained level well above $100. Why does that matter? Because all of these projects are going to cost a lot of money to put together. Hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. So that's, if it happens that, guess what happened to shale gas happens to shale oil, and crude oil prices drop, which could happen. I mean, it's not a bet I want to make necessarily, but the fact of the matter is I'm not making the bet. It could happen. expended considerable personal capital insisting that natural gas prices in the lower 48 were going to stay above $6. I betcha no matter what, I'm sure of it. We spent years modeling this stuff. We thought we'd looked at everything there was to look at. And then shale gas happened. And we were really violently wrong. Commodities it's a fool's errand trying to actually predict them. So it's entirely possible that we could end up in a $70 oil world. If we ended up in a $70 oil world and it's private money on the line, you pay hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars for a system that actually maybe nobody uses because it's cheaper not to pay any conversion costs and just stay on heating oil. The fact that these lines cross over at realistic oil prices, again, if you're not below the black dashed line, you're not saving any money. There's material. I'm not saying it's huge or catastrophic, but there's material chance that you could invest a lot of money and not make anything back. All right. These are all the same projects, but now making a very different assumption about who owns them and how they're financed. That's the only thing that's changed. And what I'm assuming here is that all projects are just like Susitna. No one is claiming that Susitna would ever be funded with private money, right? So that's a state project. If that's going to go forward, pretty much everybody anyway has in their mind, no, that's a state-funded project. Part of the reason for looking at things on an apples-to-apples basis is because if you're going to fund Susitna that way, well, you can fund other things that way. So what happens if you assume state resources are expended in the same way towards these other projects? And this is the result. Basically, if you assume state ownership, 4% debt, you get very different. That's the private ownership model. That's the state ownership model. Scales are the same. So everything comes down a lot, which tells capital expense is really important for all of these projects. The projects start coming apart. The pickup sticks kind of fall out, and the reason is because different projects have different reliance in terms of how capital intensive they are. And the better answer at any given oil price might also change. So again, there's not an answer or a solution. This just helps one understand the relative benefits at different oil prices given a financing regime. But one of the things that sort of jumps off the page is that pretty much everything, if you're willing to throw state money at it or enough state money at it, most of these things work. Most of these things provide solutions, or at least on the oil price dimension, they appear to provide solutions. Maybe it's worth going through some of the surprising results about this. I did not graph the Susitna project if you were to heat by wire on this, because it messes with the scale a little bit. The Susitna project compared to this dotted line here, which is also another electric project where you generate electricity on the North Slope and move it to Fairbanks by high voltage direct current. This is one electric project. The Susitna project, that power is like 40% more expensive. So I didn't include it on the graph because it would skew the scale a little bit. And I wanted to be able to sort of focus in on this area here, just in the picture. Now, does that mean that HVDC is better than Susitna? No. Well, but it's cheaper, right? Well, yeah, but that's not the full story, right? The particular HVDC project modeled here is probably not realistic for Fairbanks because it doesn't have adequate reliability. If you're heating by wire, you cannot afford to have your system go down hardly at all because your house freezes up, or could. So you can't live with only 98% reliability. And yet, as modeled, that project has one set of wires and doesn't have the full redundancy and reliability that you would need. But it just provides some sort of ballpark indication. Does that mean HVDC as an energy solution for Fairbanks and other stuff is a bad idea? No, it doesn't mean it's a bad idea. I think it's worth potentially giving it a look. But I'm just trying to create some context for this thing. There's some real advantages of a Susitna project as well. It's renewable energy, it is absolutely stable, and it's a 100-year project. At least. It's very long-term benefits, so it's a long-term investment. So all of these projects have different dimensions, and they're not easily comparable. We're just, again, trying to provide a framework for beginning to understand what the issues are. What else? Oh, well, this is kind of a fun one. This is a major gas sale, this line here. This is power from the major gas sale. It's not always the cheapest power delivered to Fairbanks. I like that result because it's counterintuitive, right? I mean, most of us have always assumed that when a major gas sale comes, if it ever comes, then we've got cheap energy all day long. That's not necessarily the case. It depends critically on what you can purchase that gas for. And one of the things that happens for a major gas sale, assuming it's an LNG project, is the commodity price is priced off of, as I model it anyway, the LNG export price, which is tied to oil. So as oil prices rise, that price rises, and it rises fairly steeply. So at high enough oil prices, at $130 oil prices, $120 oil prices, well, 120, you're looking at more expensive energy potentially than some of these other projects, right? If you're a modeler, that's kind of a neat result because it's counterintuitive. It's not something that you necessarily expect to find going in, which is one of the reasons why you do the work. Because, and again, I've sort of alluded to this before, there's nothing natural about cheap gas from any particular project. The commodity price piece is really important. If we're undertaking big state expenditures to get energy, nailing down those commodity price contracts is a critical piece in the overall cost of delivered energy. And it's important to nail that stuff down earlier rather than later. There's a temptation to focus, I think, often on the engineering part as opposed to the commodity price part. And those contracts are huge. And that's one of the things that this result says. A major gas sale isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. It might be. If you can negotiate a hometown discount for the gas, it will be. But maybe you can't negotiate a hometown discount. We don't have a hometown discount for oil. We might be able to get one for gas, but if you're counting on it, negotiate it first. There's several projects here which all are pretty close to each other. The bright blue one, this Fairbanks trucking project, and the smaller throughput ASAP project, and the fit for purpose pipeline project, they all are really pretty close. given modeling precision, they're very close. One of the things that all those projects more or less share is they are scaled to meet the existing demand within the state. Because of that, they enjoy stranded gas pricing. That is, there is a market today for natural gas on the North Slope. You can buy it. You can negotiate those contracts. You can buy them. And the contracts, that stranded gas, is worth less than if you unstrand the gas and have the opportunity to export it to the Asian market, say as LNG. And once you unstrand the gas, all of a sudden that same commodity's got a very different value. It's like, well, why should I sell to you for less when I can sell to somebody in Asia for more, even recognizing differences in transportation costs? Why would I do that? If I'm a producer, I shouldn't want to do that. If we're counting on a producer to sell us gas on favorable terms, what I like to call a hometown discount, that's fine, but then let's get it. Let's get it contractually, and let's get it early on in the process. I'm not saying we can't get it, but the natural, again, the natural thing is to assume that, well, wait a minute, if we're putting up a bunch of money, then they should be willing to. Or that's only fair, or we'll have leverage. And maybe we will and maybe we won't. I've spent a bunch of time in negotiations across the table, and we never have as much leverage as we wish we did. And it's very difficult to obtain the results that you want to obtain. So doing it earlier on the front end is my overriding recommendation if you want to try to secure a hometown discount. This analysis assumes that you can't get one. It's an assumption. Prove me wrong. I want to be wrong. I think potentially you could be wrong. But again, somebody's got to negotiate those deals. This, again, the idea that moving 500 million a day actually did well. Moving 500 million a day generates, in this chart, you can't see that, the same delivered cost of energy is moving 1 billion cubic feet a day. Wait a minute. Same project? How could that be? Right? It's got to be cheaper to move the gas if you're moving a lot of it through the same pipe. Answer, it is cheaper. But the transportation cost isn't the whole story. Right? The question is the commodity price. And again, I'm assuming there's no hometown discount. So as soon as you hit the export market, my going in assumption is if the producer who's selling you the gas is going to, well, wait a minute, again, I can sell to Asia. So even though a larger project has got lower transportation costs, I'm going to pocket that benefit and sell to my Asian customer. If you want to buy that gas, I might be willing to sell it to you, but there's no hometown discount. So you're gonna pay at the end of the day those prices. I will say, just sort of, when you work around these things for long enough, you sort of have projects before you've analyzed them that you kind of are fond of. It's like, well, I kind of like that one. So the Beluga to Fairbanks project, which was pushed most recently by Harold Hines, I was really kind of hoping would look better than it did. It just, part of the problem is it's an expensive pipeline and you don't move very much gas, and cook inlet gas is more expensive than stranded North Slope gas. And so it doesn't look very favorable from a comparative perspective. On the other hand, it does get you something. What does it get you? Well, Harold's plan was always, let's start delivering gas to Fairbanks soon, and then if we need to, we'll keep going. So rather than building a bullet line from north to south, we'll do it in stages. We'll first pre-build a spur line off a major gas cell, and if the major gas cell isn't coming, we'll finish building a bullet line all the way to the North Slope. So there's option value, which isn't captured in this sort of chart. This is again looking at a different risk. This risk is a real risk that we've got for pretty much all of these projects. Well, not quite all of them. Susitna, I don't think we do. And it has to do with building up the user base for the project over time. The risk, as I've shown it here, is exaggerated because it's sort of a polar extreme. I'm assuming that you build all of your project all at once, and then you start billing customers. For Fairbanks Energy relief, people have to convert from their existing system to the new system, and that process takes time. The first person on the system, right, if you have to build out a bunch of distribution network and a pipeline and gas treatment plant and so on before you can deliver the very first molecule of gas, you undergo a huge amount of expense in the very beginning. The early adopters, if the full system costs are passed on to them, face really high rates. And then over time, as more and more people come to use the system, those rates get spread out over a bigger customer base and they fall, right? Usually you've got project with great big anchor tenants which justify the initial construction of the project. It's worth it to them, their anchor tenants, it's worth it to them to go ahead and do that. They see energy savings, and then the energy savings builds off of their back, so to speak. Here, especially looking at the gas projects, this issue of gradually adding consumers to the project is a problem which people are aware of but has to get solved, because for essentially all of these projects, again, the dashed black is what heating oil runs. In your first year, private ownership at $100 oil, this is assuming $100 oil, particular oil price. In the first year, there's no savings for the early customers, right? So if you were to charge them the full freight, nobody would join. So you're going to have to do something about that problem. Now, state ownership helps a lot because the overall system is cheaper, and so that initial ramp-up risk is not as great, but it's still material. Why? Here we're assuming state ownership, right? We're assuming $100 oil. If you're only going to save 5% on your heating oil bill, assuming you're on heating oil, are you going to switch to natural gas? Are you going to spend $8,000 for a boiler? Probably not. So even in this case, if savings aren't big enough for the early customers, no one will sign up. Meanwhile, you've spent all this capital, right? So figuring out a way to buy down that early cost is something that has to get dealt with. It also means, though, that as much as possible for community energy solutions, you've got to figure out a way to get everybody in the same boat as quickly as possible. It has to be a community-based solution. If you don't collectively agree as community and as well as the state that, no, this is how we want to go ahead and do stuff, and you may not ultimately succeed, because you got to, again, you got to get everybody in the boat as quickly as you possibly can. That might mean things like revolving loan funds. That might mean like financial incentives for getting people to join early, because everybody's going to benefit if everybody joins early. I don't know what the solutions are. I haven't tried to design any solutions, but it's an important problem that needs to get solved. There are solutions out there for sure, but it needs to get wrestled with also for sure. One of the things that, like the ramp up risk on this 200 million, this 250 million a day project, that ASAP bullet line project that only meets in-state needs, it is particularly severe. It's the most severe of all. And that's because it's reflecting not just customers coming onto the system in Fairbanks, but it's also addressing the fact that you have potentially, well, you have decline rates of production in Cook Inlet. If Cook Inlet declines fast and hard, the ramp-up risk on the bullet line project is much smaller. If there's exploration success in Cook Inlet, that ramp-up risk gets bigger. And here's something that's kind of paradoxical. Cook Inlet prices will rise if you have a bullet line, right, compared to where they are now. Higher prices in Cook Inlet will serve as a powerful spur to increase exploration in Cook Inlet, which increases the ramp-up risk. So again, it's highly uncertain what will happen in Cook Inlet in terms of exploration and development success. The reason why I go into it is because, in part, the ASAP project, the bullet line project, is potentially very attractive for Fairbanks, and that attractiveness occurs in part because you're riding off of the economies of scale associated with a larger throughput project going to Anchorage. So yeah, it's higher cost, but you've got more units of sale, and that lowers the cost potentially for everybody. But again, if there's success in Cook Inlet, then those economies of scale, which you could otherwise ride on here, won't show up. So it's one of the major risks, at least as I see it, facing the bullet line project, which again, for it to move forward is something that will need to get solved. That's a risk. Those are sets of risks which will need to get solved. There are ways of solving them. But potentially the risks are very enormous. I mean, measured in billions of dollars. Same story, different, much narrower slice. I'm focusing here right now on ramp-up risk only on the part of the system associated with Fairbanks heating, the distribution of natural gas in Fairbanks, okay? So assuming you have a project which is distributing natural gas in Fairbanks, you've got to build out that system, right? I'm looking here at the infrastructure costs only as ramp-up builds. The ramp-up risk is going to be a function of at least, just for the cost of distribution, not cost of commodity, not cost of getting it here, just cost of distribution. That ramp-up risk will be a function of how quickly people adopt. If people come on more slowly, the ramp-up risk is bigger, right? If people come on more quickly, it's smaller. So in this case, the green lines are representing, okay, so that's speed. Dashed is quick ramp up, solid is slow ramp up. Part of the issue, though, too, with this ramp up risk is it's a function of uncertainty in the overall heating level in Fairbanks. We don't know. Nobody knows how many BTU are actually consumed for heating here. In Anchorage, it's really easy. You go to NSTAR and you look at how much gas they sell. And since essentially everybody's on gas, you can know, because there's one seller. You can know how much heat people use there. It's really pretty straightforward. Here we don't have any direct measurement like that. Heating oil sales are distributed, right? You all buy heating oil from different places. Some of you are on wood. That doesn't show up here. Nobody's collecting central wood statistics, right? So we actually have to make educated guesses about what the heating load is. One approach is to assume that heating load in Fairbanks looks like heating load per square footage in Anchorage, adjusted by the fact that it's colder up here. And that's a perfectly reasonable modeling assumption to make. It's wrong, of course. I can't tell you how it's wrong, but modeling assumptions are always wrong. But that's the assumption that the Fairbanks Economic Development Council or corporation has taken in their work. And it's a totally defensible and reasonable approach. And those are the green lines, right, at different ramp-up rates. So the green are sort of their assumptions about total heating needs here. Cold climate housing research did some work some years back looking at data from the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation's weatherization programs and taking site-specific information on people's houses, what kind of windows they had, blower door tests, how much insulation they said that they had, and then running all that stuff through an engineering model gonculator and saying, well, here's what the heating needs are for this house, assuming my engineering model is correct, giving all these inputs. That's what the red lines look like. It's wrong too. We don't know what the right answer is. There's some uncertainty. We're in the ballpark, but you know, the final difference is only worth maybe $1. That's material, $1 per MMBTU. We care about that. It's real money. But if you back that up and look at solving the ramp-up risk in the first year, those relatively minor differences, these are differences in total heating needs of about 18%. In the very beginning, they magnify. They're much larger. And again, these are things that you can narrow the scope of uncertainty by doing some more analysis and some more work and looking at more housing stock and doing more modeling and so on. It's actually kind of important to do that work so that we understand how big the problem is so that we can solve them on the front end. Because these are problems we have to solve on the front end so they don't bite us. Part of the moral of this story is like this kind of comparison work is important to do to understand different sorts of risk. We've talked about like what are oil prices going to be, so you've got commodity price risk. You've got construction cost risk, which we haven't talked about, but in this study we model. You've got an inflation risk, which we model. You've got financing models, you know, different costs of money, which actually we kind of have modeled here. I mean, implicitly in terms of the ownership structure, it's really clear. The cost of money really matters. The cost of debt really matters. So we've looked at different risks, but there's also this other issue. We think that for most of this stuff, we want to throw state money at it because it really reduces overall costs. I mean, like dramatically. And yet it's also the case that we probably as a state can't do all of these things. And one of the reasons is these are expensive projects. All of these are very expensive projects. They are capital intensive. None of them is under $1 billion. They all exceed $1 billion. You know, the Susitna project, its costs have, as I understand, not modeled here, but I understand that they've gone up. They now exceed $5 billion. Kind of be expected. Some of it's just inflation. Some of it's increasing refinement of scope. Again, all of these cost estimates are wrong, but it shows these are ginormous projects. I guess the one project that I realize now I should have mentioned before that I hadn't ever looked at in terms of state ownership was a major gas sale. And the reason why is because the state can't do it. It's too big. The sort of current midpoint estimate for that cost of that project, it would exceed $53 billion. State doesn't have the credit capacity to pull that off, not by itself. So for that project, I just assume that's, if it happens, that's a private undertaking. All the rest of them, I assume that the state, or at least I modeled the state sort of biting that stuff off and looking at it. But yeah, we've got choices, and the choices show up at different sorts of scales as well. And so one of the things that people have to figure out is what can we afford? Because we can't afford to do everything. We wouldn't want to do everything. But all of these projects have got sort of different scopes in terms of who they serve, different characteristics, different risk profiles, different lengths of life. And this is one of the dimensions that people need to weigh. So again, I'm not giving you any answers. I wanted to come back and just underline a couple things about the LNG trucking project, mostly just because it seems to be getting some traction right now politically. Again, my big story on this is the gas purchase price terms are critical. And I think it's not just the gas purchase price terms, it's also the duration of those terms and the flexibility of those terms. I, in my former job, saw contracts, or at least proposed contracts for gas sales, where the pricing term would essentially expire upon a major gas sale. Say, well, at that point we need to renegotiate. I think for things like the trucking project, it will be very important that that gas supply term lasts, even if there's a major gas sale before before a 25-year period expires. That's flexibility value that I think folks who live in this area are going to want to have. And it's worth fighting hard to get. Because, again, once there is a major gas sale, we don't necessarily know what the pricing regime looks like. And it might, this is a boggler, it's kind of hard to believe, but it might be worth paying for the cost of a plant on the North Slope that's no longer even being used to make LNG, so that you can then take that same gas at a hometown discount and put it into the pipe and then bring it off here. You're going to, even though you're paying for the plant, you might be able to save on trucking transportation costs. And if you can depreciate that over a longer period of time, that is, recover the cost of that plant over a longer period of time, energy costs, at least in the beginning here, will be lower than if you have to recover all those costs over a shorter period of time. And that will be beneficial to getting everybody in the boat. It's important that we all get in the boat quicker and more collectively, if we can, because it'll be better for everybody. Understanding exactly how big the ramp-up risks is important. I've presented sort of a worst case, because I assume that you have to pay for essentially all of the cost of the infrastructure up front. That's wrong. I mean, that's not the case. But I didn't have enough detail in terms of plant trains, sizes, and cost estimates and so on to come up with more sophisticated modeling. That needs to get looked at. Getting a better sense of Fairbanks heating demand needs to get looked at. So better understanding, those risks are things that can be better understood and should be, because they need to get dealt with. There are a whole bunch of ways of resolving some of those risks. Revolving loan funds to help finance people's cost of switching will help, absolutely. It may not be sufficient. I mean, essentially, we've shown probably by itself wouldn't be sufficient. So you're going to have to do something else in addition. It's one of the reasons, actually, why Bob Shevchuk, who's working on a version of this project, is insisting that we need to get the cost of this project in terms of delivered energy below 15 bucks. That's a mechanism for dealing with ramp-up risk. Why? Because $15 per MMBTU is about the cost of wood. So again, part of the ramp-up risk is between now and whenever a project may come, people are making decisions. They're making economically rational and reasonable decisions, and they're moving away from heating oil. People are putting in wood systems all the time because it's cheaper. Air quality issues, but it's cheaper. So I'll stop there, and I would be pleased to entertain any questions if there are any. Yes?
My question is, when you were comparing the cost per million BTU tied to oil between the different gas line projects and also the HVDC line, did you include the cost of local distribution infrastructure in that analysis?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering like the third slide where you compared the different alternatives when they were state funded. What if just the interest on the debt service for even a small project were applied as a simple rebate toward Fairbanks homeowners for heating fuel? How would that compare? Since we have to do the debt service anyway.
That's a great question.
It's ideologically unpalatable, but
It is. It's a great question. And Brent and I talked about doing that, and like this work isn't really done. And the final write-up, I think that comparison should be done, because it is a completely ideologically unpalatable. People want cheap energy. They don't want a check. And that's fine. Like, at a certain level, I don't care. But those are choices, right?
it's a real alternative.
It is a real alternative. Back in 2000 and what was it? When was the Palin Energy rebate, right? It was 2009, right? It was a huge amount of money which was dispersed that way. Could we have done something to build something with that money which would have yielded long-term benefits? Yeah, well, maybe. So there's downsides to that, but it's an alternative, and it's a reasonable thing to look at. So I haven't run that, but it's a reasonable thing to do. Absolutely. Yeah.
And under Harold's plan of taking the gas from Blue to Fairbanks,
Yeah.
wasn't it in his plan also that eventually a line from North Slope would come and connect that and reroute the gas back down again when they were depleted?
Yeah, it would have that option value. In the event of a major gas sale, you'd have that ability to do that as a spur line. So you're sort of pre-building a spur line, right? I mean, that was sort of the idea is, no, we'll pre-build a spur. It doesn't make sense necessarily as a solution standalone for energy, but for Fairbanks. But we're probably going to need a spur line to Anchorage eventually anyway. So Fairbanks is hurting, so let's do that now, right? I think it's a compelling idea. It's an option value sort of story, right? And the added advantage that Harold talked about was you could then potentially take that line. If a major gas sale didn't look like it was going to happen, well, fine. You construct the boat line by another means, right? And then you just keep going. The value, again, of that project really absolutely is fully in its optionality. I think the main barriers to that project right now is Cook Inlet is so distressed in terms of supply availability right now. That could change any minute. But right now, we're definitely in a gas-tight world. And so it'd be very difficult to get economical gas out of Cook Inlet, assuming you could get it at all. NSTAR is not able to get its needs met under long-term contracts in Anchorage. No one will sell them the gas on a long-term basis to bridge those needs. So they, every winter now, for the last 2 winters, I think this is the third winter, are buying gas in an unmet needs spot market environment. And looking at the behavior of that market is exceptionally interesting. One of the things that we're seeing is in the spot market, gas prices in Cook Inlet are essentially equivalent to LNG export prices. So it's there's no hometown discount, right? If I'm ConocoPhillips and I'm producing gas out of the North Cook Inlet field and I can liquefy it and ship it to Japan, or I can sell it into the spot market in Anchorage, I have a duty to my shareholders to get equivalent value, at least. And as well, we've got market concentration in Cook Inlet. So when people can exercise market power, if you look at the data in that market, you're seeing that that is occurring. That's not a bad thing. It's just is saying this is what economic actors do. We may not think it's fair, but it's what they do. Yeah.
On all of your graphs, the price of oil is the x-axis, I do believe.
That's, well, yeah,
Or
on the first several, yeah.
So one of the major questions becomes is gas continue to be tied to oil?
That's right.
That's right, and it's one of the fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves. If you look around the world, Henry Hub is now generally understood in the markets to be decoupled from the price of oil.
Absolutely true.
And if you look worldwide in Indonesia, Northwest Australia, all over the world where LNG projects are occurring, what you find is kind of a blend of a tie to oil, a coupling of oil, but maybe only 50% in the equation. The rest of the equation is tied to the capital cost to deliver the project. So there is a fundamental decoupling of oil and gas.
Well, wait, hold on. I'm not going to go that.
Okay, let's just look historically.
Yeah.
If you look at Anchorage,
Yeah.
its gas was stranded. It was decoupled from the price of oil. They enjoyed 30-year record low energy prices. So the
Wait,
fundamental
hold on,
question-
no. Actually, what you just said isn't quite right. If you look at those utility contracts, they were actually indexed to oil. They were not priced at oil heat equivalent. My point is not that my assumptions around LNG export, I'm tied to oil, but I'm not pricing at LNG, at oil heat equivalents.
Okay, let's just go forward. Let's look to
Yeah.
the future just a little bit.
Yeah.
What is the likelihood that North Slope gas will become a worldwide commodity and demand the price to the point to where Fairbanks can't get a home price discount? That's one of the fundamental questions. What is the likelihood of a large diameter gas pipeline with export? And if you look around, the Canadians are racing. Parnell's in Japan trying to sell them gas. The Canadian Prime Minister's over there at the same time doing it. Qatar has, and where's Alex Gatos? He knows more about this. He's a proponent of the fit to size lines. What is the likelihood that we'll sell gas? Well, if you look at the utility gas, what's this gas worth to Fairbanks? What's this gas worth to Fairbanks just to heat our homes and just to power our economy? It's worth more than all the royalties we'll ever get. And it's called the utility value of that gas. That gas in the North Slope is worth more to Fairbanks and more to Anchorage than we'll ever realize exporting it, minus Johns. And there's, as you say, in modeling, there's a lot of that argument that's wrong, but there's a portion of it that's also right.
Well, so you might be right about your prognostication of those markets and how they unfold. I think there's a really good story to tell that as there are increased development of shale gas around the world, the historical premium that we've seen for about the last 10 years associated with LNG pricing is going to be eroded. And as that happens, there's a really good story to tell, I think, that a major gas sale never occurs for LNG because it doesn't pay enough to make it work. So that's a credible, possible future. And it might be the right one. It's also the case that it could be otherwise. I mean, I've done this enough and been so violently wrong enough that, like, I have to admit, like, I don't know. And the very best companies in the world at this do not know. In the energy industry, there's tremendous herd mentality. ConocoPhillips paid $35 billion or something like this for acquiring Burlington Resources. It was a natural gas play. Jim Mulva said, oh, no, we've stressed this transaction at $6 gas and it works. We've even looked at it at $5 gas and it works, right? Now these are some of the most sophisticated folks on the planet in this business, and that company arguably still has not recovered from that acquisition fully. ExxonMobil made a great big acquisition in the gas space in North America, right? And I think they were expecting other things. Now, at the end of the day, those companies may be smarter than all of us, and guess what? I think there's a reasonable story to tell. The shale gas story is totally oversold. I mean, totally oversold. There's a reasonable story to tell that, and there are people who make their money telling, their livelihood telling that story, and they might be right. And there are good reasons for thinking that that's true. If that's true, is an LNG world like a high value world? Probably. So, I mean, I don't know, but I would be suspicious of anybody who says that they do, personally. I mean, that they know, right? I don't know. Yeah.
What's the current projection for shale gas in the lower 48 and some of the issues that may derail that presumption? Like
well, sure. I mean, why am I, like right now, like gas in Henry Hub, I don't think he even has a 3 handle on it, right? It's priced under $3. I mean, it's amazing. And a bunch of that is driven by liquids values. It's driven by the fact that we've got very high oil prices. Folks are producing liquids-rich gas plays to get the liquids, which are marketed at crude oil prices, and the gas is a waste product, right? So that's one of the things that's helping, doesn't totally account for it, but it's helping drive down natural gas prices. There are an awful lot of folks who are losing their shirts at these gas prices. So what could cause things to rebound? Well, it may be the case that on a lifetime basis, a lot of these plays are not as attractive as people are currently modeling them in the short. Decline curves are incredibly rapid. And generally, you expect people are going after the sweet spots first in these plays. There are going to be constraints of one sort or another. We don't know when they'll be, but we know that there will be. Water use is one of them. Water disposal is another one. Tax regimes is another one, potentially. Land use issues is also another potential issue, right? I mean, a lot of the Marcellus shale play is in areas that are highly populated. I mean, incredibly highly populated. And the water use issues there are material. Will they get solved? Maybe. Maybe. Will we be looking at cheap gas for 100 years? Maybe. But there are a lot of pretty bright people who are forecasting. I mean, when you ask what is the forecast, well, boost. I've generated those forecasts, right? I've generated forecasts to try to understand price formation and kind of believe the results. And this is part of the problem of doing modeling is you invest yourself and then you start believing that the models are real. And they're not, right? They're not. They're just models. That's all they are. So if you look at EIA price projections, the North American market is soft as far as the eye can see. A major gas sale overland into North America, forget about it. Not going to happen. And if that's actually the world that we're in, there's a good story to tell that LNG prices will soften, right? You open up the Panama Canal, you start exporting LNG out of North America, and you start seeing those price differentials collapse some between North American gas and Asian gas. And if that happens, right, then a major gas sale maybe doesn't happen. But it's a mistake to think that, well, hey, we got $3 gas now, we're always going to have $3 gas. Really? You believe that? I don't believe that. But I don't know what it'll be. Maybe it's $5 gas, maybe it's $4. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm getting back to the hometown discount.
Yeah.
Are gas royalties a possibility with a lease contract similar to oil royalties?
Yeah. It's the same issue. There are constitutional issues, right, around making royalty hydrocarbons available for free or very, very minimal cost. But setting those issues aside, right, it's still the fact that some people, I think, when they're looking at a bullet line, are assuming at the end of the day that the state is going to take its royalty gas and make it available to the citizens of Alaska, right? You can't do that. Why? Well, in the context of a major gas sale, you could, once you deal with constitutional issues. But for a bullet line project, you can't. Why not? There is no royalty gas until there is production from the field. The state's royalty exists metaphysically as the gas is produced by the leaseholders. We have no rights to take our 12.5% share out of the field first. That's not part of the lease agreement. Royalty only exists when it's produced. It's produced by who? The lessees. So there's a confusion that a lot of folks often have. And I'm not saying you do, I'm just taking the opportunity to talk about it because I've been asked over the years that kind of question a lot. Like, well, no, a bullet line will be great because we'll just take royalty gas and make it available. And even if you could deal with the constitutional issues, you got a commercial issue, right? Now, could you solve the commercial issue? Could you do a deal whereby the North Slope producers said, yeah, you can take your royalty gas first? Anything is possible. But you have to ask, what is it possible? It ain't going to be free. That's not how this works, right? I mean, it's not going to be free. Will it be cheap? No. Why would I do you a favor just to be a good guy? I mean, these are companies that are in the business of making money. They have rights. They intend to use them. That's what they will do. Do they need to reach accommodation with the people of the state? What's your leverage? It's a commercial transaction. You need to have leverage. The more leverage you have, the better off your end result's going to be. Yeah?
I've got two tangentially related questions. The first is, you were saying that historically, heating oil prices and crude oil prices are very strongly linked.
They're highly correlated.
Okay, so do you think that that would still be true if there were viable alternative energy sources?
Yes.
Okay, so you think that would remain?
Yes.
And
the
then
correlation might change, but it would remain.
Okay. And then have you considered or looked at the differences between the different projects in terms of time to availability of
Yes.
the product?
Yes, absolutely. It's an important issue, which I didn't capture here. One of the things that probably nobody focused on is those initial graphs that I put up. We're looking at economic results in 2023.
Right.
Why? Because that's the first time that all the projects could potentially be online. Right?
If you started them all today, then they can all
If
be.
you essentially start them all now, some of them have that big a lead time. Right? Susitna does.
Right.
The major gas sale does.
Right.
So
But
the LNG trucking project I model is potentially being online in 2016. If you were willing to take some risks, maybe you could make that happen even quicker, I don't know, 2016, call it. The fit for purpose pipeline, I had coming in at, and the HVDC project I had coming in at 2019. Now these are all success-like cases. This is you start a project, you commit to it, and nothing goes sideways, right? But success-like case, 2016, 2 projects come in at 2019. The bullet line projects come in at 2020, I think. Susitna 2023, I think, or 20, yeah, I think 2023. Same thing for a major gas well. So, but that is a really, really important issue, right? It affects this whole ramp-up issue, right? It gets worse because people do other things. They leave, they convert to wood, they do something else. But also, meanwhile, people are suffering. So, a solution sooner, all else equal, is arguably better.
Is there a significant difference in the infrastructure cost and ramp-up time for bringing natural gas to Fairbanks versus bringing the electricity to Fairbanks?
That's a really good question. So, the question was about the ramp-up of bringing electricity to Fairbanks, as opposed to natural gas to Fairbanks.
Comment on that, please?
Go ahead.
Corey Burgess' talk the other night mentioned that, the electric line, and he says the engineers are just afraid of that because of the distribution lines around town. So that's a big factor.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm really not an electric guy, so I can't speak to those power system issues really. However, the infrastructure costs generally associated with electricity, you would think that those are more readily solvable build-out issues than if you're building a whole natural gas distribution from scratch. That's neither here nor there, right? And I wouldn't pretend to be able to capture the nuance of the reliability issues and the pinch points around town, because you'd be moving a lot more power. I mean, a lot more power. So again, I don't really understand that, but on the face of it, you think electricity it's an easier way. In that dimension.
It seems like there's also a value added there to solving our pollution problem.
Yes, sure. Although it's true that natural gas, in terms of your particulate issues, will make an enormous difference. People have looked at this, and it is hugely beneficial. Now, one of the things, though, that I should say is that gas distribution is not going to solve everybody's problems, right? It's not going to be economical at all, no matter what, for some folks in town. And so, what are you going to do about that? People who live further away, the economics of running very small diameter gas lines out just aren't going to work. So that's potentially one of the comparative attractiveness of, say, wires is, shoot, don't we already have wires in most places? Not every place, but most places.
That's got to be the last word, I'm afraid. We have to clear out of here by 7:30, but I want to thank Antony for his presentation.